Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Knowledge Hub, and I'm talking to John Arthur, who is author of this book, Building a Resilient Organisation. And John is a freelance consultant who specialises in building reasoning systems for organisations to manage risks and resilience needs. John, that sounds like a good place to start. Do you want to explain what that means?
Yeah, so I'm an occupational psychologist by training. So I began life in the human factors area and quickly developed a specialisation in risk in high-risk organisations. Like generally, the thing that kept all my work together was it was always about an organisation needing to tackle some concept that they had built, which they then called risk. And so I began to develop more theory around the risk area, and particularly around how you build systems and tools and training, and how you then sort of conceptualize that and actually do something which I would call a cognitive behavioural approach. You find a way to make people frame their thinking and change their behaviour,
right.
Rather than just necessarily develop sort of reassurance or checklists or fear lists or things like this. And my clients are a big range of very, very different organisations that all have one thing in common. They all need to stimulate resilience in a community setting or in a large organisational setting, or that they're dealing with inherently sort of large quantities of something that they call risk. I go into organisations and I play what I call the idiot savant card, which is I've got loads of techniques that help me to respond to what you want to tell me the problem is, but I don't know what the problem is. And not only that, I don't know your industry. I don't understand the first thing about it.
Sure.
So what you'll have to do is train me in what is important to your industry and how your people think. And then from there we'll begin to look at how do they, in an interdependent way, how do they reason about constructs like risk and resilience? And from there we then choose the most sort of suitable line of intervention. If we begin by saying any organisation that truly wants to be resilient has to accept that will involve a combination of I know people talk in threes, but of at least three things. It will have to be about operational reality. It will have to be some sort of operational model that is a good model of what they do. Have to have operational flavour to it. It will have to have organisational psychology in it. It will have to allow the psychology of communication or culture or management or whatever to come to bear. And the one that scares people most actually is that it should be subject to statistical logic. So what people always want to do, and it's absolutely good and right that they want to, is that they want to measure risk, or they want to measure resilience performance, or they want to develop key performance indicators, or they want to have a monitoring system. The minute that happens, a couple of very interesting pathologies will turn up. One is this, however much you try and say to them, what you really need is a naturalistic, journalistic system that builds narratives and helps your organisation tell itself stories about its experiences and shares knowledge. That turns people off completely, because what they want is a measurement system, and therefore it has to have a mathematical flavour. So people are hesitant about true measurement. So good statistical methodologies are very hard to find in these settings, and actually genuinely bad ones are very easy to discover. They're reticent about the organisational psychology side because they're always worried about too much sort of touchy-feely intervention in their hard systems. And they're actually quite reticent about the operational logic side because they set unrealistic goals from the off. So the first goal that they set is that it mustn't disrupt, and that it mustn't take too long, and that it mustn't be too complicated. In the book we talk about one of the fundamental sort of citadels that you have to attack for true systems reasoning is the appetite for complexity. Businesses are fiercely complex and really impressive at what they do, but they have no appetite for complexity in any alien area. So if you say your resilience system, the reasoning system there needs to be very involved because it should mirror the systems you're trying to protect, they reject that and they say, no, it can be simple. The power that they want to generate from the system is massive.
Yes.
They want it to run the corporate risk register. they want it to be able to answer the regulator, they want to be able to reassure shareholders, they want their own people to change their behaviour, but the system itself, in organisations that are not forward thinking, is almost completely crippled from the beginning because of the constraints that they want to put on it, even though they are not the experts
Yes.
in the design of such a system. They are the experts in what they do.
Yes.
So they bring 1/3 of the party. They bring the operational logic part that I can't bring,
Yes.
but they don't bring the other two parts.
Yes.
And it's very tricky to disavow them of that. The spectre of best practice arrives very early in any of these conversations, and you really do want to say, what do you mean by that? Because best practice is often what everybody else is doing,
Yeah.
and that's okay. But everybody else is not necessarily flying high and solving their problems,
Yes.
and everybody else is not you. So some organisations will be very attracted to industries like military or civil contingency sort of excellence, even though it's got nothing to do with what their business does, because they think they validate that model. The first question we have to address is your appetite for complexity. How involved and detailed will you allow the system to become? Risk is a social construct, and it's actually a metaphysic. It's not even real. You can't bring me a bucket of risk. I can't get 2 kilograms of risk. I can't create £200,000 worth of risk. So it's a socially constructed metaphysic, and so therefore one of the challenges that I give organisations when they're trying to deal with risk is that they should be allowed to define for themselves what the construct means. And then I have a number of techniques to help them bed that in and say, okay, this is our risk. So in the book we talk about the fact that risk operates best, or can be best described using a dialectic form, to say that risk actually ranges on a continuum from ethics at one end, where corporate risk in particular is about ethics, about values, about ethos, about public relations, about how the company sees itself and how it wants to perform, all the way to kind of a pedantry at the other end, which is where someone is trying to minimise hazards one by one by specifying some sort of metric value for them and then adding all those up on a spreadsheet. And those are both called risk. And what you see in organisations is this kind of tendency to aggregate risk around some sort of annual statement, and that annual statement, if you ever get pulled into those processes, is enormously prescriptive about what it means by risk. And so one of the things you want to say to organisations is you need to be free to speak several dialects at the same time. You need to choose the correct dialect for the place where you want to actually have a lever of control. So breaking people out of a unitary definition of risk and actually moving them into a rather postmodern space where they're operating several different dialects at the same time. When they talk to the board, there's a necessarily clipped style to the communication that should take place there. And when they talk to a supply chain or a production line interface or a major business decision making interface, there should be another one too. One of the problems you find is that because the high level of the organisation has an extremely low tolerance for complexity, they begin to force standards onto the risk rhetoric. So they don't even look at changing the dialects. They just say it must come in this rhetoric. It must have these performance indicators. It must have a red, amber, green system. It must be plotted in a Boston box. You don't need simplification. You need complexity reduction. So I need your organisation to be allowed to speak all the dialects of risk that it needs to speak, and we'll build you a system that reduces that complexity so that when the results are communicated particularly to the senior and the external audiences, they are quite simple. But they're not simple because they never started off life with any complexity. They're simple because an analytical process has turned them into another dialect that is useful for communication, useful for reassurance. But that's not the same dialect that's useful for managing the risk at the coalface or for changing the system and putting safeguards into it. Good reasoning will be more complex, more costly, and a little bit more threatening for you. Because we'd say to you, I know you've got a 1 to 5 scale and you think that's good enough because that's quick to do, but that type of scale does not lend itself to this type of analysis. It's statistically impossible to analyse it in the way that you're doing. You're actually you're destroying any meaning that you've created, because you're using fundamentally journalistic, categorical thinking, but you're pretending that it's scalar because you venerate mathematical, technical formulations, and that's okay. If you want one of those, let's get you one of those.
Yes.
But what you've got at the moment is neither fish nor fowl, because it fills too many rules. And again, people feel a resistance to you criticising the way they measure, because, well, what's going to happen if they have to measure more accurately? It's going to take a lot more time and all that sort of stuff. And then you say to them, well, no, hold on, that there are techniques where heuristic measurement, which is what you're doing, can be more accurately done, and it can be done more transparently. You just need to accept that there is some theory behind that, and that's what needs to be applied here.
Yes.
When you ask people, where did you get this measurement scale that you've got from, 1 in 20 year events, or to £2 million worth of damage, or 20 million, where did you get this from? They are a bit sheepish, because very often these things are borrowed from somewhere else. The first thing to do is look at what you already do. So let's actually just have a very clear and sort of Chatham House rule look at what you're already doing, because one of the things I'm very keen on for organisations is that my job is not to create a system that's then so impossible for them to use that we build an entirely new language that only the people I've trained to speak it speak. That's pointless. So there must always be an interface between a risk or a resilience system, and obviously all resilience systems contain a risk component. There must always be an interface where what comes out of that system, its outputs, its decisions, are actually in the reference grammar of the organisation. So that has to be translated back into a business decision. Any risk or resilience system that does not translate its outputs back into a business decision is a failure. Because it's simply a thing that conceptualizes stuff to make people feel comfortable. And I sometimes sound like I'm speaking against the reassurance qualities of our risk and resilience system. I'm not. I'm speaking against the value inherent in it. So a lot of systems which are fundamentally reassurance-based, which create a lot of coloured spreadsheets or create registers, are there because people want to be reassured that they've done something. And they're not, and they've got very, very exacting, very low standards of complexity for what is to be done, because it's the fact that it's done that's reassuring. I'm of the opposite school. I'm saying, well, why would you do something that's not very good? You've still got to use a lot of time. You've still got to allocate people to it. You've still got to fill out these spreadsheets. What you find particularly with standard-based interventions, where people are using extremely rigorous methodologies, which are actually quite pedantic, is that the industry in question, the people in question, who are so hard pressed and so busy, which again is part of the solving the rubric of the appetite for complexity. Are you too busy to do this? And if you are, stop messing around and do something much simpler than even than what you're doing.
Yes.
But if you're not too busy, or you see that the uncertainties are too great, the decisions are too long term or whatever, then don't get people to waste their time doing something that we patently know doesn't work. Build a design that does. So then you've got to go back and say, what is it that you're trying to achieve? So the models that we have in terms of risk dialects is very good, because it says, well, where is this happening? And there is in our model a sweet spot for risk reasoning, which is where sort of where behaviour becomes procedural, where behaviour starts to happen. And so getting a model that fits in there, and then building a measurement system around that is much more desirable than having a really hardcore pedantic model which creates 200 risks in a risk register. Every single one of them has been identified, every single one of them has a leader, every single one of them has a probability and impact label, every single one of them has a colour, but none of them make any sense as an argument. And then as hard-pressed organisations go, they get less and less time. If you spend 25 seconds discussing a risk and you've got 150 of them, how much project time does that take if you're supposed to discuss them every time? So we only discuss the priority ones. Like, how did you get this? Well, we chose the ones that were high. It's like, but you chose the ones that were high. The theory of risk tells you the thing that kills you doesn't come from what you've identified as high. It comes from a lateral thought system. So there are ways to rebuild the architecture of people's thinking around this. So yes, we have to set the appetite for complexity, but when that's set, and yes, people have to have confidence that what comes out of this will actually be business decisions, including invest. One of my criticisms of the standards-based approaches to business continuity, to resilience and to risk is that there's never an inherently financial element to it. Not only is there no transparent cost to the business to doing the thing, but it's never turned back into profit, turnover, loss potential. It's never turned back into those things. And when you say to people, why hasn't that got a financial metric, which is what businesses thrive on, they say that will be too difficult. And you're like, it's not too difficult for the business to manage its very sophisticated finances all the time. Why couldn't you have recruited some of those people into your expert panel who could build you proxies for loss prevention, who could build you proxies for functioning, what would happen to a market if it functioned under conditions of duress brought on by one of these crises that you're discussing. You could do the metrics to say this is how much it would damage this stock keeping unit portfolio if this thing happened. Are we worried about that?
Yes.
And so then we enter into this providential area of risk where we talk about phenomenology. And although it's sneaky because we begin to reintroduce narrative, we begin to reintroduce scenario-led thinking, but people actually start to cash that out in business terms and in business decisions. And a good resilience system always does that. It always cashes out its reasoning back in the business terms. So that when I meet with an organisation, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what the business grammars are, what the appetite for complexity is. We'll do an audit of the integrity of what's going on with the existing system, because some of it will be quite reusable. And then we'll say, given this playing field, a better system for you would look like this. Can we research that, pilot it with groups, test it, evaluate the effort involved in it? The thing that frightens people actually is that the outputs of a genuinely good resilience system are always quite costly, because they actually result in organisational change.